In federal courtroom 14B, silence shattered like glass when Jacob Lane, a widowed janitor clutching a mop, stood and declared, "I will defend her." Every eye turned toward the man in work clothes daring to speak for billionaire CEO Vivien Storm, a woman whose empire hung by a thread, whose lawyer's chair sat empty, whose ice-cold heart was about to meet the one man who would melt it. This is their story, a collision of two broken souls that rewrote destiny itself. The fluorescent lights of the Manhattan Federal Courthouse buzzed with an almost sinister hum as Jacob Lane pushed his cleaning cart down the marble corridors at 5:47 a.m. The wheels squeaked in a rhythm that had become the soundtrack to his life, monotonous, predictable, forgotten, just like him. He paused outside courtroom 14B, fishing the keys from his worn coveralls, 38 years old, shoulders bent not from age, but from carrying the weight of a world that had taken everything from him. His wife Sarah's wedding ring hung on a chain around his neck, hidden beneath his uniform, a reminder of love lost and promises broken by fate. "Daddy, will you be famous someday?" His 7-year-old daughter Emma had asked him just that morning, her gap-toothed smile bright as sunshine over breakfast cereal. "Famous people are just regular people who got lucky, sweetheart," he'd replied, not knowing that in 12 hours, those words would prove prophetic. The courtroom was empty, cathedral quiet in the pre-dawn darkness. Jacob flipped the switches and light flooded the space where justice was supposed to live. He'd cleaned this room for 3 years, had heard fragments of cases through the vents, had studied the patterns of power and privilege that played out on this stage. But today was different. Today, the most talked about trial of the decade would begin. People of the United States versus Vivien Storm. Jacob had read about it in every discarded newspaper, had caught glimpses on the break room television. Vivien Storm, 34 years old, CEO of Stormtech Industries, worth $2.8 billion, and accused of securities fraud that could destroy her empire and land her in federal prison. The media painted her as an ice queen, ruthless and untouchable. But Jacob had learned long ago that newspapers rarely told the whole story. He began his routine dusting the judge's bench, wiping down the witness stand, straightening the chairs where 12 jurors would decide a woman's fate. As he worked, muscle memory took over, leaving his mind free to wander to the folder hidden in his locker. 3 weeks ago, while emptying trash in the prosecutor's office, he'd noticed discarded documents, digital forensics reports, metadata analyses, financial records with timestamps that didn't match the accusations. Jacob Lane might be just a janitor, but he'd once been 3 semesters away from a law degree before Sarah's cancer diagnosis changed everything. Before medical bills devoured their savings. Before grief swallowed his dreams. The law still lived in him, sleeping, but not dead. "Excuse me." The voice cut through his thoughts like crystal through silence. Jacob spun around, mop in hand, to see her. Vivien Storm stood in the doorway like a vision carved from marble, tall, elegant, wrapped in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than his annual salary. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, her face a mask of composure. But her eyes were the color of storm clouds, and they held something Jacob recognized, the hollow ache of someone who'd lost everything that mattered. "Ma'am, the courtroom isn't open to the public yet," Jacob said, setting down his mop. "Trial doesn't start until 9. "I know." Her voice was silk over steel. "I'm the defendant." And heat crept up Jacob's neck. Of course she was. He'd seen her picture in the papers, but photographs hadn't captured the intensity of her presence, the way she seemed to command space, simply by existing in it. "I couldn't sleep," she continued, stepping into the room with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to boardrooms and board meetings. I don't know what I thought." Jacob watched her survey the space, this arena where her future would be decided. Her fingers drummed against her thigh, the only tell that beneath the perfect facade lived a woman made of flesh and fear. "Big day," he offered quietly. She laughed, but the sound held no humor. "That's one way to put it." She moved to the defendant's table, ran her manicured fingers along the polished wood. 20 years I've built this company, 20 years of 18-hour days of sacrificing everything for something greater than myself. And now you're here. Now I'm here. She turned to face him, really seeing him for the first time. What's your name? Jacob Lane. Jacob. She tested the name like wine on her tongue. Do you know why I'm here, Jacob? He leaned against his cart, studying her face. Behind the armor of her suit and success, he glimpsed something vulnerable, a crack in the ice that let him see the woman beneath. According to the prosecution, you manipulated financial reports to inflate stock prices, costing investors millions, he said carefully. Her eyes widened slightly. You've been following the case. Hard not to. It's all over the news. And what do you think? Am I guilty? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Jacob looked at this woman, this powerful, brilliant, broken woman, and saw something the media missed. Maybe it was the way her hands trembled just slightly when she thought he wasn't looking. Maybe it was the exhaustion carved into the lines around her eyes. Or maybe it was the recognition of one lonely soul seeing another. I think, he said slowly, that the truth isn't always what it seems. Something flickered across her face. Surprise, perhaps. Or hope. My lawyer quit yesterday, she said suddenly. 3 days before trial. Said the case was unwinnable, that I should take the plea deal. She laughed bitterly. 15 years in federal prison for crimes I didn't commit. Jacob's hands stilled on the mop handle. Why didn't you? Because I'm not guilty. The words came out fierce, desperate. And because someone has to stand up for the truth, even if I have to do it alone. The morning light was beginning to filter through the high windows, now painting golden squares on the floor between them. In a few hours, this room would be packed with reporters, lawyers, spectators, hungry for blood. But right now it was just the two of them, a janitor and a CEO, two people the world had written off in different ways. You won't be alone, Jacob heard himself say. Vivien's head snapped up. What? The words had surprised him too, but something in her voice, something in the way she stood there facing the destruction of everything she'd built with quiet dignity, stirred something in him that had been dormant for too long. Nothing. I just meant, you'll have people supporting you. But even as he said it, they both knew it wasn't true. The media had already convicted her. Her own board had distanced themselves. Her lawyer had abandoned her. She was walking into battle alone. Vivien stepped closer, close enough that he could smell her perfume, something expensive and subtle that spoke of boardrooms and power lunches. But beneath it he caught something else, the faint scent of fear. Jacob, she said softly, can I ask you something? He nodded. Do you believe in justice? Real justice. It was such an unexpected question from a woman who lived in penthouses and commanded billions. But looking into her eyes, he saw the same doubt that had haunted him since Sarah's death. The question of whether the universe operated on any principle of fairness at all. I want to, he said honestly. I used to study law before life got in the way. I believed then that the truth mattered, that the system worked. And now I clean up after the system every night. I see what gets thrown away, what gets forgotten. I see how justice looks different depending on where you're standing. Vivien nodded slowly. I've spent 20 years believing that if you worked hard enough, if you were smart enough, if you built something meaningful, the world would recognize it, protect it. She gestured to the empty courtroom. I was wrong. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, the sound of the courthouse coming alive. Soon the machinery of justice would grind into motion, and Vivien Storm would take her place at the defendant's table alone. I should go, she said, but she didn't move. Ms. Storm, Jacob called as she finally headed for the door. She turned back. For what it's worth, he said, I hope you're right, about the truth mattering. Something shifted in her expression, a softening around the eyes that transformed her face completely. Thank you, Jacob. That means more than you know. She left, then her heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown timer. Jacob stood alone in the courtroom, surrounded by the smell of cleaning solution and the weight of impending drama. He finished his work in silence, his mind churning with thoughts he couldn't quite name. At 8:45 a.m., Jacob found himself back in the courthouse, but not in his coveralls. He'd gone home, showered, and put on his one good suit, the black one he'd worn to Sarah's funeral. It didn't fit quite right anymore, but it would have to do. He'd left Emma with Mrs. Rodriguez next door, claiming he had an errand to run. But the truth was more complicated. Something about his conversation with Vivien Storm had awakened something in him, some sleeping part of his soul that remembered what it felt like to care about justice, about truth, about standing up for what was right. The courtroom was packed now, a circus of reporters and spectators drawn by the scent of blood in the water. Jacob slipped into the back row, just another face in the crowd. But his eyes were fixed on the defendant's table where Vivien sat alone, her composure absolute but fragile. Judge Harrison Blackwood took the bench, a silver-haired man with the bearing of someone who'd seen every species of human drama. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today for the matter of People of the United States versus Vivien Storm. Ms. Storm, where is your legal representation? Vivien rose gracefully. Your Honor, I'll be representing myself. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Representing herself in a federal fraud case. It was legal suicide. Ms. Storm, Judge Blackwood said, his voice carrying decades of judicial experience. I must strongly advise against proceeding without counsel. The charges against you are serious securities, fraud, market manipulation, conspiracy. You're facing up to 20 years in federal prison. I understand, Your Honor, but I also understand my innocence. Very well. Prosecution, you may proceed with your opening statement. 8A. Margaret Chen rose from the prosecutor's table like a predator sensing weakness. She was sharp, ambitious, and this case was her ticket to the Attorney General's office. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Chen began, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade. Greed has a face, and you're looking at it. Vivien Storm built her fortune on lies, manipulation, and the stolen dreams of ordinary investors. For 3 years, she systematically falsified financial reports, inflated revenue projections, and painted a picture of success that was nothing more than an elaborate house of cards. Jacob watched Vivien's face as Chen painted her as a villain, a predator in designer clothing who'd built her empire on the backs of hardworking Americans. Her expression never changed, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands lay perfectly still on the table, too still. The evidence will show, Chen continued, that Ms. Storm authorized the creation of false invoices, the manipulation of digital timestamps, and the systematic concealment of StormTech's true financial condition. When the house of cards finally fell, innocent investors lost everything. Pension funds, college savings, retirement accounts gone because this woman chose greed over honesty. The prosecution's case was methodical, devastating. Expert witnesses testified about manipulated financial data. Former employees described pressure to inflate numbers. Digital forensics experts pointed to electronic evidence that seemed to place Vivien at the center of a massive fraud. But Jacob noticed things others missed. The timestamps on the digital evidence didn't align with Vivien's known schedule. The metadata showed files created from IP addresses in Zurich, Switzerland, when corporate records placed her in Seattle. The electronic signatures on the falsified documents used an encryption key that had been compromised 6 months before the alleged crimes. He'd studied enough law to recognize reasonable doubt when he saw it. But without a lawyer to present these inconsistencies, without someone to cross-examine the witnesses and challenge the evidence, Vivien was drowning in a sea of circumstantial proof. By lunch break, the case looked hopeless. Spectators filed out, already writing her obituary in their minds. But Jacob remained seated, his folder of researched documents heavy in his lap. Rough morning. Jacob turned to find an elderly man in a worn cardigan settling into the seat beside him. He had the look of someone who'd spent a lifetime in courtrooms. A court reporter, maybe. Or a retired clerk. You following the case? The man asked. Something like that. Name's Bill Henley. Covered trials for the Post for 40 years before I retired. Seen a lot of innocent people go down because they couldn't afford the right representation. He nodded toward the defendant's table. That woman's got backbone, I'll give her that. But backbone doesn't cross-examine witnesses. You think she's innocent? Bill chuckled. Son, I've learned that guilt and innocence are just starting points. What matters is what you can prove, and right now the prosecution is proving a hell of a case. He paused. Of course, I've also seen cases turn on the smallest details. One good question, one piece of overlooked evidence, one person willing to stand up and point out that the emperor has no clothes. Jacob's grip tightened on his folder. What if someone had information that could help her case? You mean someone like you? Jacob's head snapped around. Bill's eyes twinkled with the wisdom of someone who'd seen every courtroom drama played out. I don't know what you're talking about. Son, I've been watching people in courtrooms for 4 decades. You've been taking notes all morning, cross-referencing documents, and your jaw's been getting tighter every time the prosecution scores a point. Either you're a very invested spectator, or you've got skin in this game. Jacob stared at this folder in his hands. Inside were 3 weeks' worth of research inconsistencies in the prosecution's timeline, metadata that pointed to external manipulation, financial records that suggested a frame job orchestrated by someone with intimate knowledge of StormTech's systems. I'm nobody, he said quietly. Just a janitor who used to want to be a lawyer. Abraham Lincoln was just a rail splitter who read law books by candlelight, Bill replied. Sometimes, being nobody is exactly the qualification justice needs. The afternoon session began with more devastating testimony. Richard Crenshaw, Vivien's former assistant and the prosecution's star witness, took the stand with the bearing of a man unburdening his conscience. Ms. Storm demanded that I alter the quarterly reports, he testified, his voice carrying perfectly across the silent courtroom. She said the real numbers would kill investor confidence, and that we needed to massage the data to maintain market stability. And did you comply with these demands? Ada Chen asked. I did. To my shame, I did. Jacob watched Vivien's face as her former trusted aide painted her as the architect of her own destruction. Still, she maintained her composure, but there was something else in her expression now, a flicker of betrayal that cut deeper than any legal charge. Mr. Crenshaw, Chen continued, can you identify the defendant's signature on these falsified documents? Yes, that's Vivien's signature on all of them. But Jacob had studied those documents. The signatures were technically correct, but they'd been applied using Vivien's digital certificate, a certificate that had been compromised in a security breach 6 months earlier. He'd found the breach report buried in a stack of discarded IT memos. As Crenshaw's testimony continued painting Vivien as a calculating manipulator, Jacob felt something building inside him, a pressure that had been mounting all morning. It was the feeling he'd had in law school when a professor presented a case with obvious holes, when justice was being perverted by incomplete information. Your Honor, Vivien said, when given the chance to cross-examine, I have no questions for this witness. The courtroom murmured in surprise. She was giving up, refusing to fight back against testimony that was destroying her. But Jacob could see what others missed: the exhaustion in her shoulders, the resignation in her voice. She was a brilliant CEO, but she wasn't a trial lawyer. She didn't know how to dissect testimony, how to reveal the inconsistencies that Jacob could see from the gallery. Judge Blackwood called a brief recess. As the courtroom emptied, Jacob found himself moving toward the defendant's table, where Vivien sat alone, staring at her hands. Ms. Storm. She looked up, and he was struck again by the storm cloud color of her eyes, but now they held something new: defeat. Jacob, the janitor who believes in justice. Her voice was soft, hollow. Come to watch the execution. Come to ask why you're giving up. Her laugh was bitter. Because I'm not a lawyer. Because I don't know how to fight this kind of fight. Because maybe Chen is right. Maybe I am guilty of being naive enough to trust the wrong people. Jacob glanced around the nearly empty courtroom, then slid into the chair beside her. Richard Crenshaw's testimony had holes in it. What? The digital signatures he claims are yours. They were applied using a certificate that was compromised last year. The timestamps on the documents don't match your travel schedule. The IP addresses traced to servers in Switzerland, not Seattle. Vivien stared at him. How do you know all this? Jacob opened his folder, spread the documents across the table. Financial records, IT reports, travel manifest, digital forensics data, 3 weeks worth of investigation done in the margins of his real job. Because I've been studying this case. Because I see things other people throw away. He met her eyes. Because sometimes the janitor is the only one who notices that the emperor has no clothes. For a long moment, Vivien said nothing. She studied the documents, her brilliant mind processing the implications. When she looked up again, her eyes held something Jacob hadn't seen before: hope. Why? She whispered. Why would you do this for me? It was a question Jacob had been asking himself all morning. Why did he care about the fate of a woman who lived in a different world from his? Why had he spent his free time researching her case instead of helping Emma with homework or catching up on sleep? Because 20 years ago, my wife got sick, he said quietly. Cancer. I dropped out of law school to take care of her, to work to pay the medical bills that insurance wouldn't cover. I watched a system that was supposed to protect us fail at every level. And when she died, I thought justice was just another word for whatever the powerful could afford. Vivien's eyes softened. But watching you this morning, Jacob continued. Seeing you stand up here alone, refusing to admit to crimes you didn't commit, even when it would be easier. It reminded me why I wanted to study law in the first place. Because sometimes someone has to stand up for the truth even when everyone else has given up. Did Jacob? The recess is ending, he said, gathering the documents. You need to use this information. Cross-examine Crenshaw. Show the jury that the evidence doesn't add up. I don't know how. Then let me help. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. A janitor offering to help defend a billionaire CEO. It was absurd, legally questionable, and completely impossible. You can't, Vivien said. You're not my lawyer. No, Jacob said, standing as people began filing back into the courtroom. But I am someone who believes that the truth matters more than protocol. Judge Blackwood retook the bench. Ms. Storm, do you wish to call any witnesses? Vivien stood, her hand resting on Jacob's folder of evidence. For a moment she hesitated, caught between the safe path of defeat and the dangerous road of hope. Your Honor, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word, I would like to recall Richard Crenshaw for cross-examination. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Ada Chen looked surprised and concerned. Very well, Mr. Crenshaw, please retake the stand. As Crenshaw settled into the witness chair, clearly irritated at being recalled, Vivien approached with Jacob's documents in her hand. The transformation was remarkable. The resigned woman of moments before had become the sharp-focused CEO who'd built a billion-dollar company. Mr. Crenshaw, she began, you testified that I personally instructed you to falsify financial documents. Is that correct? Yes. And these instructions were given during our regular weekly meetings. That's right. According to these travel records, Vivien said, approaching the witness stand, I was in London for the International Tech Summit on September 15th, the date you claim I gave you explicit instructions to alter the Q3 projections. How do you explain that discrepancy? Crenshaw's eyes flickered. The meetings weren't always in person. We spoke by phone. At what time? I don't remember exactly. You don't remember the time of a phone call where your boss allegedly asked you to commit federal crimes? Ada Chen stood. Objection. Argumentative. Sustained. Rephrase Ms. Storm. But Vivien was just getting started. Jacob watched from the gallery as she systematically dismantled Crenshaw's testimony, using the evidence he'd compiled to expose inconsistency after inconsistency. The IP addresses, the compromised security certificates, the timeline discrepancies. Piece by piece, she built a case for reasonable doubt. Mr. Crenshaw, she said, approaching her finale, isn't it true that you had access to my digital signature certificate through your role as my assistant? Yes, but... And isn't it true that this certificate was compromised in a security breach 6 months before the alleged crimes? I wouldn't know about that. This is the IT security report filed with our corporate insurance, Vivien said, holding up one of Jacob's documents. It specifically mentions the compromise of executive-level digital certificates, including mine. As my assistant, you would have received a copy of this report. Crenshaw's composure was cracking. Sweat beaded on his forehead. I may have seen it, but... And isn't it true that you resigned from StormTech just days before the SEC investigation became public? I had other opportunities. With Alter Holdings, a direct competitor to StormTech. Ada Chen shot to her feet. Objection, relevance. Goes to bias, Your Honor, Vivien replied smoothly. I'll allow it. Mr. Crenshaw, please answer the question. Yes, I took a position with Alter Holdings, a company that would benefit significantly from StormTech's destruction. The courtroom was electric now. Jacob could feel the shift, could see jurors leaning forward as the narrative changed before their eyes. Vivien Storm wasn't just defending herself, she was revealing a conspiracy. But it was what happened next that no one expected. From his seat in the back row, Jacob watched as realization dawned on Vivien's face. She was winning, but she was also alone. Despite the evidence, despite her brilliant cross-examination, she was still one person against an entire system designed to crush the inconvenient. That's when Jacob Lane, widowed janitor and failed law student, did something that would change both their lives forever. He stood up. Your Honor. His voice carried across the hushed courtroom clear and strong. I would like to address the court. Every head turned. Judge Blackwood looked confused. Ada Chen looked annoyed. And Vivien Storm looked at the man who'd already given her hope and was now offering something more. Sir, you are not a party to these proceedings, Judge Blackwood said. No, Your Honor, I'm not. I'm just a janitor who believes that justice is too important to be left to those who can afford it. The judge's gavel was halfway to the bench when Jacob's next words stopped him cold. I have evidence that this court needs to see. In the defendant's seat, Vivien Storm felt something crack open in her chest. Not the brittle shell of professional composure, but something deeper. Something that had been frozen for so long. She'd forgotten it existed. Someone was fighting for her. Someone was standing up when the whole world had sat down. And for the first time in 20 years of building walls around her heart, Vivien Storm realized she wasn't alone. The courtroom held its breath, waiting for Judge Blackwood's decision. In that moment of suspended time, two people who had started the day as strangers found themselves bound together by something more powerful than law, more binding than contracts. They found themselves bound by the truth. And the truth, as Jacob Lane was about to prove, had a voice of its own. Judge Blackwood's gavel hovered in the air like a sword of Damocles. The courtroom had become a theater frozen in time, every breath held, every eye fixed on the man in the ill-fitting black suit who had dared to interrupt the sacred proceedings of federal justice. Mr. Judge Blackwood paused, his silver eyebrows raised in question. Lane, Your Honor. Jacob Lane. Mr. Lane, this is highly irregular. You cannot simply, Your Honor. Jacob's voice cut through the judicial protocol like a knife through silk. If this court is truly interested in justice, then it needs to hear what I have to say. Ada Chen was on her feet, her face flushed with indignation. Your Honor, this is preposterous. This man has no standing in these proceedings. He's disrupting a federal trial. But Jacob was already moving, walking down the center aisle with the steady gait of a man who had finally found his purpose. The folder of evidence was clutched in his hands like a sacred text, and his eyes never left Vivien's face. She was staring at him with something between wonder and terror, as if witnessing a miracle that might destroy them both. I am prepared to hold you in contempt, Mr. Lane, Judge Blackwood warned, but his voice carried more curiosity than threat. In 30 years on the bench, he'd seen every variety of courtroom drama, but this was something new. Then hold me in contempt, Your Honor. Jacob replied, reaching the bar that separated the gallery from the well of the court. But first, let me tell you about Richard Crenshaw's offshore bank accounts. The courtroom erupted. Spectators leaned forward. Reporters scribbled frantically. And in the prosecutors section, Ada Chen's face went pale. Judge Blackwood's gavel came down like thunder. Order. Order in this court. When silence returned, he fixed Jacob with a stare that had intimidated seasoned attorneys. Mr. Lane, you have exactly 60 seconds to convince me not to have you arrested. Jacob stepped through the gate, entering the sacred space where only licensed attorneys were permitted to tread. But he moved with the confidence of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Your Honor, 3 weeks ago, while performing my duties as a janitor in this courthouse, I discovered documents that had been improperly discarded. Documents that reveal a conspiracy to frame Vivien Storm for crimes committed by others. He opened his folder, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to unleash. Richard Crenshaw, the prosecution's star witness, received payments totaling $3 million from Alter Holdings in the 6 months leading up to his resignation from Stormtech. These payments were disguised as consulting fees, but the timing coincides exactly with the period when the alleged fraud took place. Vivien's sharp intake of breath was audible in the silence. Even she hadn't known about the money trail. Furthermore, Jacob continued, his voice growing stronger. The digital forensics evidence presented by the prosecution shows that the falsified documents were created from IP addresses registered to servers in Zurich, Switzerland. But corporate travel records show that Ms. Storm was never in Switzerland during the relevant time periods. However, Alter Holdings maintains a significant server farm in Zurich, and Mr. Crenshaw had access to these servers through his new position. Judge Blackwood leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. And you discovered this information, how Mr. Lane? By doing what I do every night, Your Honor. I clean up what people throw away. And sometimes what people throw away is the truth. Ada Chen found her voice. Your Honor, even if this man has stumbled across legitimate information, he has no legal standing to present it. He's not an attorney, he's not representing anyone, and this evidence hasn't been properly authenticated or entered through discovery. She's right, Judge Blackwood said slowly. Mr. Lane, while your initiative is admirable, there are procedures that must be followed. Jacob felt the moment slipping away. The truth was right there, documented and provable, but the machinery of justice was grinding to halt on the gears of procedure. He looked at Vivien, saw the hope dying in her storm-cloud eyes, and felt something ignite in his chest. Your Honor, he said, his voice carrying the weight of every loss he'd endured, every dream he'd abandoned, every night he'd spent alone, wondering if fairness existed anywhere in the world. I'm not a lawyer. I'm just a man who lost his wife to a system that cared more about rules than results. I'm a father trying to teach his daughter that truth matters, that standing up for what's right is worth the risk. The courtroom was absolutely silent now, hanging on every word. But I studied law for 3 years before life forced me to choose between my dreams and my family. I know enough to recognize that justice isn't about following procedures when those procedures are being used to bury the truth. And I know that sometimes when everyone else sits down, someone has to stand up. He turned to face Vivien fully, and the look that passed between them was electric, charged with something deeper than legal strategy or courtroom theatrics. It was the recognition of two souls who had found each other in the darkest moment of their lives. Ms. Storm, Jacob said formally, would you accept me as your legal counsel? The question exploded through the courtroom like a bomb. Ada Chen shot to her feet. Objection! He's not even licensed to practice law. Actually, Judge Blackwood said slowly, consulting something on his computer. Mr. Lane, what is your educational background? I completed 3 years at Columbia Law School, Your Honor, before personal circumstances required me to withdraw. I passed the first year and second year examinations with honors. Judge Blackwood's fingers flew across his keyboard. And you never took the bar examination? No, Your Honor, but I never stopped studying law. It's been my passion for 20 years, even when life took me in other directions. The judge was quiet for a long moment, the weight of an unprecedented decision settling on his shoulders. Ms. Storm, this is your trial. Mr. Lane cannot represent you without your explicit consent, and I must warn you that accepting representation from someone without a law license is unusual. Vivien stood slowly, her eyes never leaving Jacob's face. In that moment, she wasn't a billionaire CEO weighing a business decision. She was a woman who had spent 20 years building walls around her heart, and someone had just offered to tear them down. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Jacob Lane has shown more dedication to justice in the past hour than the entire legal establishment has shown me in the past year. If the court will permit it, I would be honored to accept Mr. Lane as my counsel." Judge Blackwood removed his glasses, cleaned them slowly, and put them back on. "This is highly irregular. Mr. Lane, you understand that you would be operating under severe limitations. You cannot examine witnesses, you cannot make opening or closing statements, and any evidence you wish to present must be filtered through Ms. Storm herself." "I understand, Your Honor." "And Ms. Storm, you understand that you are essentially representing yourself with Mr. Lane serving as an advisor." "I understand perfectly, Your Honor." The judge looked around his courtroom at the reporters scribbling furiously, at the prosecutors conferring in heated whispers, at the jury, watching this drama unfold with rapt attention. Then he looked back at Jacob and Vivien, standing side by side like warriors preparing for battle. "Very well. Mr. Lane, you may advise Ms. Storm, but you will conduct yourself with the dignity and respect due this court. One step out of line and you will be removed. Is that clear?" "Crystal clear, Your Honor." As Jacob moved to join Vivien at the defense table, she leaned close enough that he could smell her perfume, could feel the warmth of her breath against his ear. "Thank you," she whispered, and the words carried more weight than any legal contract. "Don't thank me yet," Jacob murmured back, spreading his documents across the table. "We're about to go to war." Judge Blackwood called for a brief recess to allow the new defense team to confer. As the courtroom emptied, Jacob and Vivien found themselves alone at the defense table, surrounded by evidence that could change everything. "Show me what you have," Vivien said, but her eyes were studying Jacob's face rather than his documents. He opened the folder, revealing weeks of meticulous investigation. Bank records showing suspicious payments. Digital forensics reports revealing IP addresses that traced to Alter Holdings. Travel manifests that alibied Vivien for crucial dates. IT security reports documenting the compromise of her digital certificates. "My God," Vivien breathed, scanning the documents. Where did you get all this?" "3 weeks of garbage duty," Jacob said with a wry smile. "Amazing what people throw away when they think no one's looking." "Stay." Vivien looked up at him, and Jacob was struck again by the intelligence in her eyes, the quick mind that had built a technology empire from nothing. But there was something else there now, something warmer and more dangerous. "Jacob, this is brilliant work. This is better than anything my previous legal team produced. But I have to ask, why you barely know me? You could lose your job over this, maybe face legal consequences. Why would you risk everything for a stranger?" Jacob was quiet for a moment, considering the question that had been haunting him since he'd first stood up in court. "When Sarah was sick," he said finally, "I watched her fight for 2 years against cancer that the doctors said was incurable. She never gave up, never stopped believing that tomorrow might bring a cure, a miracle, some reason to keep fighting." His voice grew softer. "The night she died, she made me promise her something. She said, 'Jacob, don't let the world make you small. Don't let them convince you that one person can't make a difference.' I've spent 7 years trying to keep that promise, but I'd forgotten how until I saw you this morning." Vivien's eyes glistened. "What did you see?" "I saw someone fighting alone against impossible odds, refusing to give up, even when everyone else had written her off. I saw someone who still believed that truth mattered more than power." He met her gaze directly. "I saw Sarah." The silence between them stretched like a bridge across 20 years of separate pain. Vivien reached across the table, her fingers brushing against Jacob's hand. The touch was electric, sending shockwaves through both of them. "I've never had anyone fight for me before," she said quietly. "Not like this. Not when it mattered." "Well, you do now." Their hands were still touching when Ada Chen returned from recess, her face set in grim determination. She'd spent the break on the phone with her superiors, and the message had been clear: destroy this janitor before he destroyed their case. Your Honor, Chen said, as court reconvened. The prosecution moves to exclude all evidence presented by Mr. Lane on the grounds that it was obtained illegally and without proper chain of custody. Jacob started to rise, but Vivien placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. This was her moment, her battle to fight. Your Honor, she said, standing with the grace of someone born to command boardrooms. The evidence in question was lawfully discarded in public areas of this courthouse. Mr. Lane, in the course of his legitimate employment, discovered documents that had been improperly disposed of. There is no expectation of privacy for abandoned materials as established in California versus Greenwood. Judge Blackwood raised an eyebrow. Ms. Storm, you seem to have developed quite a command of evidence law in the past 20 minutes. Vivien smiled, and for the first time since the trial began, it was genuine. I've had an excellent advisor, Your Honor. Very well. The evidence will be admitted subject to authentication. Ms. Storm, you may continue your case. What followed was unlike anything the courthouse had ever seen. Vivien Storm, guided by Jacob's research and strategy, systematically dismantled the prosecution's case. She recalled digital forensics expert Dr. Marcus Webb, the man who had originally testified that the evidence pointed conclusively to her guilt. Dr. Webb, Vivien began consulting Jacob's notes. You testified that the metadata on the falsified documents originated from Ms. Storm's personal computer. Is that correct? Yes. But you also testified that this metadata showed the documents were created using an IP address registered to servers in Zurich, Switzerland. How do you reconcile these seemingly contradictory pieces of evidence? Dr. Webb shifted uncomfortably. Well, it's possible that Ms. Storm was using a VPN or proxy server to mask her actual location. Possible, but you found no evidence of VPN software on my personal devices, did you? No, but. In fact, your own forensics report notes that my computer showed no signs of advanced networking software, no evidence of remote access capabilities, and no history of connecting to foreign servers. Isn't that correct? That's correct. Vivien moved closer to the witness stand, her confidence building with each question. Dr. Webb, are you familiar with the concept of digital certificate spoofing? Yes, of course. And if someone had access to a compromised digital certificate, say one that was stolen in a security breach, they could use that certificate to create documents that would appear to have been signed by the certificate's owner, couldn't they? Dr. Webb's eyes darted toward the prosecution table. In theory, yes. This is the IT security report filed by Stormtech Industries 6 months before the alleged crimes, Vivien said, holding up one of Jacob's documents. It specifically documents the compromise of executive-level digital certificates, including mine. You were provided with a copy of this report during your investigation, weren't you? The silence stretched like a taut wire. Dr. Webb looked at Ada Chen, then back at Vivien. I may have seen it, but you chose not to include this crucial information in your testimony, didn't you? You chose not to tell this jury that there was a documented security breach that could explain how someone else might have used my digital signature to create these documents. Objection, Chen shot to her feet. Argumentative. I'll rephrase, Vivien said smoothly. Dr. Webb, does the existence of this security breach create reasonable doubt about the origin of the digital signatures on these documents? Dr. Webb looked like a man being led to the gallows. It's possible. From the defense table, Jacob watched Vivien destroy the prosecution's case with surgical precision. She was magnificent, brilliant, relentless, completely in her element. But more than that, she was fighting not just for her freedom, but for something deeper. She was fighting for the truth, for justice, for the belief that one person could stand against the machine and win. Their eyes met across the courtroom, and Jacob felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't just about legal strategy anymore. This wasn't just about evidence and reasonable doubt. Something was happening between them, something that had nothing to do with courtrooms, and everything to do with two people who had found each other at the exact moment when they needed saving. The afternoon wore on as Vivien methodically destroyed witness after witness. She presented evidence of Richard Crenshaw's financial ties to Alter Holdings. She demonstrated how the supposed fraud had actually benefited Stormtech's competitors more than Stormtech itself. She showed how every piece of digital evidence pointed not to a conspiracy led by her, but to a conspiracy targeting her. But it was when she recalled Richard Crenshaw himself that the real bombshell exploded. "Mr. Crenshaw," Vivien said, approaching the witness stand with a document in her hand, "you testified that I instructed you to falsify quarterly reports. You were very specific about the dates and times of these conversations." "That's right. According to your own testimony, I gave you explicit instructions to inflate revenue projections during our meeting on October 3rd. Do you remember that testimony?" Crenshaw's jaw was tight. "Yes." "This is a copy of your employment contract with Alter Holdings," Vivien said, placing the document before him. "Notice the signature date." Crenshaw's face went white. "October 1st, Mr. Crenshaw. You signed a contract with our direct competitor 2 days before you claim I asked you to commit fraud. Isn't it interesting that your decision to become a whistleblower coincided so perfectly with your new employment?" That doesn't mean anything." "Doesn't it? This contract guarantees you a bonus of $5 million contingent on what it calls successful transition of market position. What do you suppose that means?" Ada Chen was on her feet, but Judge Blackwood waved her down. The courtroom was electric, with tensioned spectators leaning forward to catch every word. "Mr. Crenshaw," Vivien continued, her voice carrying the steel that had built an empire. "Isn't it true that Alter Holdings hired you specifically to sabotage Stormtech from within? No. Isn't it true that you used your access to my digital certificates to create fraudulent documents that would implicate me in securities fraud? That's a lie. And isn't it true that when the SEC investigation began, you saw an opportunity to destroy your former employer while positioning yourself as a heroic whistleblower?" Crenshaw's composure finally shattered. "You don't understand. You were going to destroy everything. Your reckless expansion, your crazy projects, your refusal to listen to the board. You were going to run the company into the ground." The courtroom exploded. Judge Blackwood's gavel came down like machine gun fire, but the damage was done. Richard Crenshaw had just confessed to conspiracy to fraud, to everything the prosecution had accused Vivien of doing. In the chaos that followed, Jacob caught Vivien's eye and saw something that made his heart race. She was looking at him not as her advisor or her legal counsel, but as a woman looks at a man who has just changed her life forever. The truth was out. The conspiracy was exposed. But as Jacob Lane watched Vivien Storm stand triumphant in the wreckage of her enemy's lies, he realized that the real trial was just beginning. Because somewhere between the evidence and the objections, between the legal strategy and the courtroom drama, two broken people had found something neither of them had been looking for. They had found each other. And in a world where justice was rare and love was rarer still, that might just be the most dangerous discovery of all. The afternoon sun slanted through the high windows of Courtroom 14B, painting everything in golden light, as the most unlikely legal team in federal court history prepared for the fight of their lives. But the battle for Vivien Storm's freedom was about to become something much more personal, much more dangerous, and much more beautiful than either Jacob Lane or the woman he was fighting for could have imagined. The silence that followed Crenshaw's outburst was deafening, broken only by the frantic scratching of reporters' pens and the soft whir of courtroom cameras capturing what would become the most talked-about confession in federal court history. Jacob watched as Richard Crenshaw's face cycled through the stages of a man who had just destroyed himself with his own words: shock, panic, and finally a resigned acceptance that his carefully constructed lies had crumbled like a house of cards. Judge Blackwood's gavel had long since stopped its thunderous demands for order. The courtroom had settled into an electric stillness, every person present understanding they were witnessing something extraordinary. In the prosecutor's section, ADA Margaret Chen sat frozen, her star witness's confession echoing in her ears like a death knell for her career. Vivien remained standing at the witness podium, her posture perfect, her expression controlled. But Jacob could see the slight tremor in her hands, the barely perceptible catch in her breathing that betrayed the magnitude of what had just occurred. She had spent a year being branded a criminal, watching her life's work crumble under the weight of false accusations, and in a single moment of perfectly executed legal strategy, the truth had finally broken free. "Mr. Crenshaw," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like silk over steel. "Let me ask you again, and I remind you that you are under oath. Did you or did you not use your access to StormTech systems to create fraudulent documents designed to implicate me in securities fraud?" Crenshaw's lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Davidson, who had been frantically whispering in his client's ear, finally found his voice. "Your Honor, I need to consult with my client about his Fifth Amendment rights." "A bit late for that," Judge Blackwood observed dryly. "Mr. Crenshaw, you've already answered the question rather thoroughly. Would you like to clarify your previous statement?" The former StormTech assistant looked around the courtroom like a trapped animal. His eyes found Jacob's face in the defense section, and for a moment something passed between them, a recognition of one man's desperation, meeting another man's quiet determination. Crenshaw had gambled everything on his lies, just as Jacob had gambled everything on the truth. Crenshaw's voice broke. He cleared his throat, looked at his lawyer, then back at Vivien. "I want to invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination." "Mr. Crenshaw," Judge Blackwood said, his voice carrying 30 years of judicial authority, "you have already made statements under oath. You cannot selectively invoke the Fifth Amendment to avoid clarifying those statements." Davidson was on his feet. "Your Honor, my client was clearly under duress." The defense's questioning was designed to confuse and intimidate. "Objection," Vivien said calmly. The witness's statements were voluntary and responsive to properly posed questions. Judge Blackwood studied the chaos before him. A star witness admitting to the crimes he'd accused the defendant of committing. A prosecutor whose case had just imploded. A defendant representing herself with the help of an unlicensed janitor who had somehow uncovered a conspiracy that had escaped notice by teams of federal investigators. "Mr. Crenshaw," the judge said finally, "I'm going to give you one opportunity to clarify your testimony. Did you conspire with persons unknown to frame Ms. Storm for securities fraud?" The courtroom held its breath. Jacob felt Vivien's tension radiating across the space between them, felt his own heart hammering against his ribs. This was the moment that would define everything, not just the trial, but the future that was taking shape between two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances. Crenshaw looked at his hands, then at the jury, then finally at Vivien. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes, I did." The courtroom erupted. Spectators gasped. Reporters shouted questions, and Judge Blackwood's gavel came down like thunder. But Jacob's eyes were fixed on Vivien, watching as 20 years of emotional walls crumbled in real time. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for months, and her perfect composure finally beautifully shattered. She turned toward Jacob, and the look that passed between them transcended every professional boundary, every social convention, every rational reason why a billionaire CEO and a widowed janitor should remain strangers. It was the look of two people who had just won the most important battle of their lives together. "Your Honor," ADA Chen said, rising on unsteady legs, "the prosecution requests an immediate recess to reassess our position in light of this development." "I imagine you do," Judge Blackwood said, his tone suggesting he was less than sympathetic to the prosecution's predicament. "Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Mr. Crenshaw, you will remain available for further questioning, and I suggest you consult very carefully with your attorney about your legal position." As the courtroom emptied in a chaos of excited voices and hurried footsteps, Jacob and Vivien found themselves alone at the defense table, surrounded by the scattered documents that had brought down a conspiracy. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, painting them both in warm gold. "We did it." Vivien whispered the words barely audible. "You did it," Jacob corrected. "That cross-examination was brilliant. I've never seen anything like it." She laughed, but the sound was fragile, threaded with exhaustion and disbelief. "Jacob, none of this would have happened without you. The evidence, the strategy, the courage to stand up when everyone else sat down." She trailed off, looking at him with something deeper than gratitude. "You saved me. We saved each other." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that had nothing to do with legal victories and everything to do with the electric current that had been building between them since their first encounter in the empty courtroom that morning. Jacob was acutely aware of how close they were sitting, how the stress and triumph of the day had stripped away all pretense, leaving them exposed to each other in ways that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with the human heart. "Vivien," he said softly, testing the sound of her name without titles or formalities. "Jacob." Her voice was barely a breath, and when she looked at him, her storm cloud eyes held vulnerability he'd never seen before. This wasn't the ice queen the media had portrayed or the corporate titan who commanded billions. This was simply a woman who had been alone for too long, looking at a man who understood loneliness from the inside out. The moment stretched between them like a bridge over an abyss, charged with possibility and weighted with consequence. Jacob was about to speak when the courtroom doors burst open and a flood of reporters poured in, cameras flashing, voices shouting questions. "Ms. Storm, what's your reaction to Crenshaw's confession? Is it true you're being represented by a janitor? Will you be seeking damages against Alter Holdings?" Vivien's mask slammed back into place with practiced efficiency. She stood smoothing her skirt, her expression cooling to professional neutrality. But as she turned to face the media storm, her fingers brushed against Jacob's hand, a touch so brief it might have been accidental, but the electric jolt it sent through him suggested otherwise. "I have no comment at this time," she said, her voice carrying across the chaos with commanding authority. "Any statements regarding today's proceedings will come through proper channels." Jacob gathered his documents, watching as Vivien navigated the media scrum with the skill of someone who'd been doing it for 20 years. She was magnificent in her element, poised, controlled, untouchable. But he had seen behind the mask, now had glimpsed the vulnerable woman beneath the corporate armor, and he knew that something fundamental had shifted between them. As the reporters finally dispersed, leaving them alone again, Vivien's composure wavered. She sank back into her chair, suddenly looking every bit as exhausted as Jacob felt. "God, I hate this part," she murmured, rubbing her temples. "The circus, the speculation, the way they reduce everything to sound bites and scandal. It comes with the territory, doesn't it? Being successful, being in the public eye." She looked at him with something like surprise. "You know, no one's ever asked me that before. Everyone just assumes I love the attention, that I thrive on being the center of everything." She was quiet for a moment. "The truth is, I built Stormtech because I wanted to change the world. I wanted to create technology that would make people's lives better. The fame, the money, the corporate politics, that was never the point." "What was the point?" Vivien's eyes grew distant. "When I was 7, my father lost his job at the steel mill. We had to move in with my grandmother, and I watched him apply for work every day for 2 years. He was brilliant, could fix anything, understand any system, but he didn't have the right education, the right connections. I swore that someday I'd build something that gave people like him a chance." Jacob felt something twist in his chest. Here was another layer of the woman the world thought they knew, not the ruthless CEO, but the little girl who'd watched her father's dreams die and decided to build new ones. Is that what Stormtech does? It's what it was supposed to do. Her voice carried a note of sadness. Somewhere along the way, it became about stock prices and market share and board meetings. I lost sight of why I started. Jacob reached across the table, covered her hand with his. The touch was bold, unprofessional, and absolutely necessary. "Maybe this is your chance to remember." She looked down at their joined hands, and Jacob saw her breath catch. When she looked back up, her eyes held something that made his pulse race. "Jacob, what's happening between us?" It was the question he'd been avoiding all day. The elephant in the room that had been growing larger with every shared glance, every moment of understanding, every barrier that had fallen between them. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I know that when I saw you this morning standing alone in that courtroom, something woke up in me that I thought had died with Sarah." "And what was that?" "The belief that some people are worth fighting for." Vivien's eyes filled with tears. She didn't try to hide. "Jacob, I I don't know how to do this. I haven't let anyone close in 20 years. I don't know how to trust, how to be vulnerable, how to be anything other than what I've built myself into. Then don't be anything other than who you are right now, Jacob said softly. Don't be the CEO or the defendant or the ice queen. Just be Vivien. She laughed through her tears. I'm not sure I remember who that is. I think you do. I think she's the woman who refused to plead guilty to crimes she didn't commit. The woman who stood up in that courtroom and fought for the truth, even when everyone else had given up on her. The woman who sees something worth saving in a broken-down janitor with impossible dreams. You're not broken down, Vivien said fiercely. You're the most courageous man I've ever met. The words hung between them, loaded with possibility and fraught with complication. Jacob was intensely aware of everything that separated them. Money, social class, the vast gulf between their worlds. But he was also aware of everything that connected them. Loneliness, determination, the shared understanding of what it meant to lose everything that mattered and still find the strength to keep fighting. Vivien, he said carefully, when this trial is over, when the media storm dies down, when you go back to your world and I go back to mine, don't. She pulled her hand away and the loss of contact hit him like a physical blow. Don't plan the ending before we've even had a beginning. Before Jacob could respond, his phone buzzed. Emma's school. His heart clenched as he realized he'd been so consumed with the trial that he'd forgotten about his daughter's piano recital. I have to go, he said, standing quickly. My daughter. Understanding flickered in Vivien's eyes. Of course, go. Jacob gathered his things but paused at the gate separating them from the gallery. Vivien. Yes. This isn't over. The case, yes, probably, but this... He gestured between them. Whatever this is, it's not over. She met his gaze directly, and for a moment the mask slipped completely away. I hope not. Jacob left her there in the golden light of the courtroom, surrounded by the evidence of their shared victory, but somehow looking more alone than ever. As he hurried through the marble corridors toward the exit, his mind was already racing ahead to the conversations they needed to have, the barriers they needed to navigate the impossible logistics of building something real between two people from different worlds. But first he had to get to Emma's recital. He had to be the father his daughter deserved, the man Sarah would have wanted him to be. He had to remember that while Vivien Storm had awakened something in him that he'd thought was dead forever, he was still Jacob Lane, a widowed janitor, with responsibilities that transcended his own desires. The piano recital was held in the elementary school auditorium, a cramped space filled with proud parents and squirming siblings. Jacob slipped in just as Emma took the stage, her small hands poised over the keys of an ancient upright piano. She was wearing the blue dress Sarah had bought her for Christmas, her hair in pigtails, her face serious with concentration. As the first notes of Für Elise filled the air, played with 7-year-old precision and heart-stopping sincerity, Jacob felt tears prick his eyes. This was his world: elementary school auditoriums and hand-me-down dresses and daughters who still believed their daddy could do anything. It was beautiful and real, and a universe away from federal courtrooms and billion-dollar conspiracies. But as Emma played, as the simple melody filled the space with its timeless beauty, Jacob found himself thinking about another kind of music, the electric symphony that had played between him and Vivien all day, the harmony of two people finding each other against impossible odds. When Emma finished, the auditorium erupted in applause. She beamed from the stage, scanning the crowd until she found Jacob's face. Her smile was brighter than the sun, and when she waved, his heart swelled with the fierce love that had sustained him through the darkest years of his life. After the recital, Emma bounded up to him, practically vibrating with excitement. Daddy, did you hear me? Did I do good? You were perfect, sweetheart. Absolutely perfect. Mrs. Patterson says if I keep practicing, I might be able to play in the spring concert with the big kids. That sounds wonderful, Em. But as they walked to the car, Emma's expression grew thoughtful. Daddy, you look different today. Different how? I don't know. Like you're not as sad. Jacob stopped walking, crouched down to Emma's eye level. His daughter had always been perceptive, but this caught him off guard. What do you mean, sweetheart? Emma considered this with the seriousness that children brought to important questions. Ever since Mommy went to heaven, you've had sad eyes. Even when you smile, your eyes are still sad, but today they're not. Jacob felt his throat tighten. Emma, did something good happen today? How could he explain? How could he tell his 7-year-old daughter that he'd spent the day falling for a woman who lived in a world they could barely imagine? How could he describe the feeling of waking up after years of sleepwalking through life? Maybe, he said carefully. Maybe something good did happen. I'm glad, Emma said simply. I want you to have happy eyes again. That night, after Emma was asleep, Jacob sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and tried to process the whirlwind of the day. The trial would likely end tomorrow with Crenshaw's confession and the prosecution's inevitable motion to dismiss. Vivien would return to her billion-dollar empire, and he would return to his mop and bucket and the quiet rhythms of a life built around single parenthood and survival. But something had changed, something fundamental and irreversible. For the first time since Sarah's death, he could imagine a future that held more than just the daily grind of getting by. He could imagine happiness, partnership, love, all the things he'd convinced himself were luxuries he couldn't afford. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Thank you for today. For everything. V. Jacob stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back. Thank you for trusting me. The response came quickly. I never trust anyone. I know. That scares me. It scares me too. There was a long pause before the next message appeared. Jacob, what happens now? It was the question that had been haunting him all evening. What happened when tomorrow came and the trial ended, and they both returned to their separate worlds? What happened when the media attention died down and the adrenaline faded, and they were left with the cold reality of everything that separated them? I don't know, he typed, but I'd like to find out. The phone was quiet for several minutes. Jacob was beginning to think the conversation was over when one final message appeared. Me too. As Jacob finally headed to bed, his mind was already racing ahead to tomorrow's court session. The prosecution would likely drop the charges, Vivien would be vindicated, and justice would finally be served. But the real question wasn't what would happen in court. It was what would happen after, when two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances had to figure out if what they'd discovered was strong enough to survive in the real world. Outside his small apartment window, the city lights twinkled like stars, each one representing a life, a story, a possibility. Somewhere out there in a penthouse that cost more than he'd make in a lifetime, Vivien Storm was probably lying awake asking herself the same impossible questions. Tomorrow would bring answers, legal, personal, and emotional. Tomorrow would determine whether the connection that had sparked between them was real enough to transcend the boundaries of class and circumstance, whether love could indeed conquer the practical realities that kept people in separate worlds. But tonight, for the first time in 7 years, Jacob Lane fell asleep with happy eyes and a heart full of hope, dreaming not of loss and loneliness, but of second chances and the possibility that sometimes, against all odds, the janitor really could win the princess. The storm was breaking, and in its wake something beautiful was about to begin. Dawn broke over Manhattan with the kind of crystalline clarity that only followed storms painting the city in soft gold, as Jacob Lane stood at his kitchen window, coffee growing cold in his hands. He'd been awake since 4, his mind churning with the impossibility of what lay ahead. Today would bring the end of the trial, but more importantly, it would determine whether the connection he'd found with Vivien Storm could survive beyond the artificial intimacy of shared crisis. Emma had already left for school with Mrs. Rodriguez, chattering excitedly about her piano recital success, blissfully unaware that her father's entire world was balanced on the edge of transformation. Jacob had kissed her goodbye with the weight of unspoken possibilities heavy on his heart, knowing that the decisions made today would reshape not just his life, but hers as well. His phone had been silent since their exchange the night before, but Vivien's final message, me too, had echoed in his mind through the sleepless hours. 2 simple words that carried the weight of admission, of hope, of fear. She wanted to find out what existed between them just as desperately as he did. But wanting and doing were separated by an ocean of complications that neither of them had yet figured out how to navigate. The courthouse steps were already crowded with reporters when Jacob arrived, their cameras and microphones creating a gauntlet he'd have to run to reach the relative sanctuary of Courtroom 14B. The media had caught wind of yesterday's dramatic confession, and the story of the janitor turned legal advisor had captured the public imagination in ways that made Jacob deeply uncomfortable. "Mr. Lane, Mr. Lane." The voices crashed over him like waves as he pushed through the crowd. "What's your reaction to Crenshaw's confession? Are you planning to take the bar exam? Is it true you're romantically involved with Ms. Storm?" The last question hit him like a physical blow, stopping him mid-step. The reporter, a sharp-faced woman with predatory eyes, pressed closer. "Our sources suggest there's a personal relationship developing between you and your client. Care to comment?" Jacob's jaw tightened. The media machine had already begun its work, reducing the complex truth of what he and Vivien had shared to tabloid speculation and innuendo. "I have no comment," he said firmly, pushing past the microphones toward the courthouse entrance. But the damage was done. By the time court convened, the narrative would be set. The janitor and the CEO, a modern fairy tale, twisted through the lens of public scrutiny. Jacob felt a familiar anger building in his chest, the same rage that had consumed him when Sarah's illness became gossip fodder for hospital staff, when private pain was transformed into public entertainment. Inside the courthouse, the familiar marble corridors offered no respite. Court officers nodded with new recognition. Fellow custodial staff looked at him with mixture of pride and bewilderment, and lawyers whispered as he passed. Overnight, Jacob Lane had become a celebrity, and he hated every second of it. Courtroom 14B was packed to capacity, with spectators spilling into the aisles and standing room only in the gallery. Judge Blackwood would have his hands full maintaining order, but Jacob barely noticed the chaos. His attention was fixed entirely on the defense table, where Vivien sat with perfect posture and practiced composure. She looked up as he approached, and the relief that flooded her expression was quickly replaced by something more complex: anxiety, maybe, or uncertainty. She'd seen the reporters outside, had undoubtedly been briefed by her security team about the growing media speculation surrounding their relationship. "Good morning," she said formally as he took his seat beside her, but her eyes conveyed a different message entirely. They asked questions he couldn't answer in public, expressed concerns that matched his own. "How are you holding up?" Jacob asked quietly, arranging his documents with practiced efficiency. "I've had better mornings," she admitted, her voice barely audible above the courtroom noise. "The press has been calling my office since 6 a.m. My board is scheduled for an emergency meeting this afternoon, and apparently, according to the morning shows, I'm having a torrid affair with my janitor lawyer." Jacob felt heat creep up his neck. "I'm sorry. I never wanted—" "Don't." Her hand moved toward his across the table, then stopped, acutely aware of the hundreds of watching eyes. "Don't apologize for something that's not your fault. This is what happens when my life intersects with anything real. The machine turns it into a story." Before Jacob could respond, Judge Blackwood entered, and the courtroom rose as one. The judge's expression was grimmer than usual as he took his seat, clearly aware of the media circus that had erupted around his courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying easily over the crowd, "before we proceed, I want to address the elephant in the room. This trial has garnered significant public attention, and I will not tolerate any disruption of these proceedings for the sake of entertainment or spectacle. Anyone who cannot conduct themselves with appropriate decorum will be removed." His eyes swept the gallery, lingering on the press section with obvious disapproval. "Now I understand the prosecution has a motion to present." ADA Margaret Chen rose slowly, the defeat already evident in her posture. The events of the previous day had destroyed not just her case, but potentially her career. Your Honor, in light of yesterday's revelations and new evidence that has come to our attention, the people move to dismiss all charges against the defendant. The courtroom erupted despite Judge Blackwood's warnings, but Jacob barely heard the chaos. He was watching Vivien's face as the words sank in, watching 20 months of stress and fear melt away in real time. Her shoulders sagged with relief, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking to reveal the exhausted, grateful woman beneath. "Motion granted," Judge Blackwood said after restoring order. "Ms. Storm, you are free to go. The charges against you are dismissed with prejudice." It was over. Just like that, the nightmare that had consumed Vivien's life for nearly 2 years was finished. Jacob felt a surge of triumph so intense it was almost painful. They had won, justice had been served, truth had prevailed against impossible odds. But even as he celebrated their victory, a part of him mourned what they were losing. In winning the case, they had lost the crisis that had brought them together, lost the legitimate reason to spend hours in each other's company, lost the professional justification for the personal connection that had grown between them. As the courtroom slowly emptied, they found themselves alone at the defense table one final time. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows just as it had the day before, painting them both in warm gold. But everything felt different now. The urgency was gone, replaced by an awkwardness that came with not knowing what happened next. "We did it," Vivien said quietly, echoing her words from the previous day. "You're free," Jacob replied. "It's over." But they both knew he wasn't just talking about the trial. The adventure was over. The fairy tale was ending, and now they had to return to their separate worlds and figure out if what they'd found together could survive in the harsh light of reality. Vivien began gathering her papers with mechanical precision, and Jacob recognized the gesture for what it was. A retreat behind professional barriers, a return to the safety of roles and expectations. CEO and janitor, billionaire and single father. Two people whose paths should never have crossed, much less intertwined. "Vivien," he said softly, and she stopped, moving her hands still on the documents. "Jacob, what are we doing?" The question came out, raw, vulnerable, stripped of all pretense. Yesterday, when everything was falling apart, when we were fighting for my freedom, it felt like anything was possible. But now the real world is waiting outside those doors, Jacob finished. Now you have to go back to being Vivien Storm, CEO of Stormtech Industries, worth $2.8 billion. And I have to go back to being Jacob Lane's single father and courthouse janitor. Is that what you want? The question hung between them like a challenge. Jacob looked at this extraordinary woman, brilliant, powerful, vulnerable, and tried to imagine walking away from what they'd discovered. Tried to picture returning to his quiet life of routine and resignation while she returned to her empire of glass and steel. "No," he said simply. "That's not what I want at all." Relief flickered across her features. "Then what do we do?" "Because I don't have a roadmap for this, Jacob. I don't know how to navigate a relationship that exists outside the parameters of my world. I don't know how to be with someone who doesn't want anything from me except me." Before Jacob could answer, the courtroom doors burst open and the media storm descended. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust forward, and voices shouted questions that reduced their private moment to public spectacle. "Ms. Storm, how does it feel to be vindicated? Mr. Lane, are you planning a career change? Are you two dating?" Vivien's mask slammed back into place with practiced efficiency. She stood, smoothed her skirt, and faced the reporters with the cool professionalism that had made her a legend in corporate circles. But as she prepared to speak, Jacob stood beside her, and something in his presence seemed to steady her. "I'm grateful that justice has been served," she said, her voice carrying easily over the chaos. "The truth has a way of emerging even when powerful forces try to suppress it. I want to thank my legal advisor, Jacob Lane, whose dedication to justice made today's outcome possible." Ms. Storm, can you comment on your relationship with Mr. Lane?" Vivien's eyes found Jacob's, and in that moment, he saw her make a decision that would change everything. Instead of deflecting or denying, instead of hiding behind corporate speak and careful distance, she chose truth. Jacob Lane is an extraordinary man who stood up for what was right when everyone else sat down. He believed in justice when I had almost given up believing in it myself. As for our relationship, she paused, her gaze holding his with unwavering certainty. That's between us. The reporters exploded with follow-up questions, but Vivien was already moving, cutting through the crowd with the authority that came naturally to someone accustomed to commanding boardrooms. Jacob followed his heart hammering with the implications of what she'd just done. She hadn't denied their connection, she'd claimed it publicly and irrevocably. They made it to the courthouse steps before the media caught up again, and Vivien's security team formed a protective barrier around them. The black town car that waited at the curb represented everything that separated their worlds, luxury privilege, the kind of life Jacob could barely imagine. "Vivien," he called over the chaos, reaching for her hand as she moved toward the car. She turned back, and the look in her eyes was pure determination. "Come with me." "Where?" "Away from this. Somewhere we can talk without cameras and speculation and the whole world watching." Jacob hesitated, acutely aware of the photographers capturing every moment of the story being written in real time about the janitor who dared to reach for a princess. "I need to pick up Emma from school in 2 hours." "Then we have 2 hours," Vivien said firmly. "Please, Jacob, don't let them decide this for us." He looked at the waiting car, at the woman whose world was so different from his own, at the photographers, documenting what might be either the beginning of something beautiful or the setup for a spectacular fall. Then he thought about Emma's words from the night before, about happy eyes and good things happening, and made his choice. "Okay," he said, taking her outstretched hand. "Let's go." The car pulled away from the courthouse in a storm of camera flashes, carrying them toward an uncertain future. Inside the soundproofed luxury of the vehicle, silence settled between them like a physical presence. They sat on opposite sides of the seat, hands no longer touching both, staring out their respective windows at the city passing by. "Where are we going?" Jacob finally asked. "Somewhere private, somewhere we can figure this out without the whole world watching." 20 minutes later, they stood in Vivien's penthouse apartment 40 floors above the city, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Manhattan. The space was exactly what Jacob had expected, minimalist, expensive, beautiful in its perfection. But it felt cold, impersonal, like a showroom rather than a home. "Drink?" Vivien asked, moving toward a bar that probably cost more than Jacob's annual salary. "Sure." She poured 2 glasses of whiskey with hands that trembled slightly, the first crack in her composure since they'd left the courthouse. Jacob accepted the glass and followed her to the windows where they stood looking out at the city spread below them like a glittering map of possibilities. "This is my world, Jacob," Vivien said quietly. 40 floors above everyone else, surrounded by beautiful things that don't mean anything. I built all of this, fought for every square foot of it, and most of the time it feels like a very expensive prison. Jacob sipped his whiskey, tasting money and age, and the kind of luxury he'd never experienced. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I want you to understand what you'd be getting into. The attention, the scrutiny, the way every aspect of your life becomes public property. The board meetings and charity galas and corporate politics that consume everything." She turned to face him fully. "I want you to understand what it would cost you to be part of my world. And what would it cost you to be part of mine?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. "What do you mean? Elementary school recitals and grocery shopping and parent-teacher conferences, Saturday morning cartoons and bedtime stories, and the kind of ordinary life that probably feels impossible to someone who commands a corporate empire." Vivien was quiet for a long moment, her storm cloud eyes studying his face with an intensity that made his pulse race. "You know what's funny? That sounds like the most beautiful life I can imagine. Even if it means giving up some of this." Jacob gestured to the spectacular view, the obvious wealth surrounding them. "Especially if it means that." She moved closer, close enough that he could smell her perfume, could see the flecks of silver in her gray eyes. "Jacob, I haven't been truly happy in 20 years. I've been successful, powerful, respected, but not happy. Not until yesterday when I watched you stand up in that courtroom and fight for something you believed in." Jacob set down his glass, turned to face her fully. "Vivien, I need to be honest about something. I don't know how to do this either. I haven't been with anyone since Sarah died. I don't know how to navigate the kind of attention that comes with being connected to you. And I have a daughter whose life would be turned upside down by all of this. I know. And the fact that you're thinking about her first just makes me... She trailed off, her voice catching slightly. It makes me care about you even more. The words hung between them like a confession, raw and honest and terrifying in their simplicity. Jacob felt something shift in his chest, some final wall crumbling under the weight of admitted truth. I care about you too, he said quietly. More than I should, more than makes sense, more than I thought I was capable of anymore. Vivien stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. So what do? How do we make this work when everything about our lives is incompatible? Jacob reached up, cupped her face gently in his hands. Her skin was soft, warm, real in a way that made all the complications seem suddenly manageable. We figure it out as we go. We take it one day at a time. We protect what matters most, Emma, your company, the things that were important before we found each other, and we build something new around them. It won't be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is. Vivien leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. Jacob, I'm scared. I've spent so long being strong, being in control, being the ice queen who doesn't need anyone. I don't know how to be vulnerable. I don't know how to need someone. Then don't. Don't be anything other than who you are right now in this moment. Don't worry about tomorrow or next week or what the press will say. Just be here with me and let's see what happens. When she opened her eyes, they were bright with unshed tears and something that looked like hope. I've never had anyone fight for me the way you did yesterday. You'll never have to fight alone again. The promise hung between them, weighty with implication and beautiful in its certainty. Jacob saw Vivien's breath catch, saw the moment when she made her own decision about trust and risk and the terrifying possibility of love. She rose on her toes and kissed him. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, a question rather than a statement. But Jacob's response was immediate and certain, his arms coming around her as months of loneliness and years of resignation melted away in the face of something real and profound and absolutely right. She tasted like whiskey and hope and the promise of second chances. And when they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Jacob, she whispered against his lips. I know. We're really doing this. I think we are. They stayed like that for a long moment, holding each other in the golden light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, two people who had found something neither had been looking for. The city spread out below them like a canvas of possibilities, and for the first time in years, both of them could imagine a future that held more than just survival. Jacob's phone buzzed, breaking the spell, Emma's school reminding him about pickup. I have to go, he said reluctantly, not wanting to break the connection between them. I know. Vivien stepped back, smoothing her hair, her composure returning in degrees. Jacob, tonight. There's going to be press coverage, speculation, probably more attention than either of us wants. Are you prepared for that? Are you? I've lived with media attention my entire adult life, but this is different. This is personal. Jacob considered the question seriously. In a few hours, Emma would want to know why her father was on television, why reporters were calling their apartment, why their quiet life had suddenly become public property. He'd have to figure out how to explain something he barely understood himself. We'll manage, he said finally. One day at a time, right? Vivien smiled, and it transformed her entire face. One day at a time. As Jacob prepared to leave, Vivien caught his hand. There's something else. Tomorrow morning, I have to face my board of directors. They're going to want explanations, reassurances, a plan for moving forward after everything that's happened. And I want to make some changes, real changes. I want StormTech to remember why it was founded, to get back to the mission of helping people rather than just making money. She paused. I was wondering if you might be interested in helping with that. Jacob blinked. What exactly are you asking? I'm asking if you'd consider coming to work for StormTech. Not as a janitor, Not as some kind of charity case, but as someone who understands justice, who believes in fighting for what's right. I need people around me who share those values. The offer hung between them like a bridge across worlds. Jacob thought about his current life, the pre-dawn shifts, the routine of cleaning up other people's messes, the quiet resignation that had settled over him like dust. Then he thought about the possibility of meaningful work, of being part of something larger than himself, of building a future rather than just surviving the present. I'd need to think about it, he said carefully. Emma's school, our routine, the practical realities. Of course, there's no rush. But Jacob, I want you to know that this isn't about what happened between us. This is about what I saw in that courtroom, someone who's willing to stand up for the truth, even when it's difficult, even when it's dangerous. Jacob squeezed her hand gently. I'll think about it. The ride down 40 floors felt like a descent from heaven back to earth. As the elevator doors opened to reveal the marble lobby of Vivien's building, Jacob was struck by the surreal nature of what had just happened. 3 hours ago, he'd been a janitor whose biggest concern was making it to his daughter's school on time. Now he was walking away from a penthouse apartment where he'd kissed a billionaire CEO and been offered a job that could change his entire life. The late afternoon sun was warm on his face as he stepped onto the sidewalk, and for a moment, Jacob allowed himself to simply breathe. The trial was over, Vivien was safe, and something beautiful and terrifying had begun between them. The future was uncertain, complicated by 1,000 practical considerations and social barriers, but for the first time in 7 years, it was also full of possibility. His phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Daddy, Mrs. Patterson says I was on TV. Are you famous now? Jacob smiled, typing back. Not famous, sweetheart. Just your same old dad. See you in 20 minutes. But as he walked toward the subway that would carry him back to his regular world of elementary schools and modest apartments, Jacob knew that Emma was right. He wasn't the same man who had woken up that morning. The events of the past 2 days had changed something fundamental in him, had awakened parts of himself he'd thought were lost forever. The hardest part would be explaining it to Emma, helping her understand that their quiet life might be about to become much more complicated. But as he thought about Vivien's offer, about the possibility of meaningful work and a future built on something more than just getting by, Jacob found himself smiling. Maybe complicated wasn't such a bad thing. Maybe it was time to stop playing it safe, to stop letting fear dictate his choices. Maybe it was time to believe in happy endings again. The subway car was crowded with the usual mix of commuters heading home from their regular jobs to their regular lives, and Jacob blended in perfectly. Just another guy in a worn suit riding the train home to his daughter. But inside, he carried the memory of storm cloud eyes and whispered promises, the taste of possibility, and the weight of a decision that could change everything. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, new complications. But tonight, for the first time in 7 years, Jacob Lane would go to sleep with happy eyes and a heart full of hope, dreaming not of what he'd lost, but of what he might yet find. The storm had broken, and in its wake, love was learning to bloom again. 6 months later, Jacob Lane stood in the conference room on the 38th floor of StormTech Tower, watching through the floor-to-ceiling windows as Manhattan spread out beneath him like a living map of dreams realized. The morning sun painted everything in gold, and for a moment he allowed himself to marvel at how profoundly his life had changed since that fateful morning when he'd first encountered Vivien Storm in an empty courtroom. He was no longer the broken janitor pushing a cart through marble corridors. The man reflected in the glass wore a tailored suit that actually fit, carried himself with quiet confidence, and held the title of Director of Corporate Ethics and Justice Initiatives, a position Vivien had created specifically for him after he'd passed the bar exam with flying colors. It had taken him 4 months of intensive study, burning the midnight oil after Emma went to bed, but he'd done it. Jacob Lane was officially a lawyer again. But more than his professional transformation, it was the personal changes that truly amazed him. The hollow ache that had lived in his chest for 7 years was gone, replaced by something he'd never expected to feel again, complete, overwhelming happiness. Daddy, are you ready? Emma's voice drew him from his reverie. She stood in the doorway of the conference room, resplendent in a pale blue dress that Vivien had helped her pick out, her dark hair styled in elegant waves that made her look impossibly grown up for an 8-year-old. "As ready as I'll ever be, sweetheart," Jacob replied, smoothing his tie with hands that trembled slightly despite his best efforts at composure. Today was the day. After 6 months of careful courtship, of navigating the complex waters, of blending their vastly different worlds, of building trust and understanding, between 3 people who had learned to become a family, Jacob was going to ask Vivien Storm to marry him. The past half year had been a whirlwind of adjustments, challenges, and small miracles. The media attention had been intense. At first, the fairy tale romance between the billionaire CEO and her janitor-turned-lawyer had captured public imagination in ways that both surprised and occasionally overwhelmed them. But they'd weathered the storm together, learning to protect their privacy while building something real and lasting. Emma had been the key to everything. Jacob had worried endlessly about how his daughter would adjust to having Vivien in their lives, but his fears had proven groundless. The brilliant, successful woman who commanded boardrooms with effortless authority became someone entirely different around Emma. Patient, playful, genuinely interested in 8-year-old concerns about homework and friends, and whether unicorns might actually exist. It had started small. Vivien joining them for dinner at their modest apartment, sitting on their second-hand couch, helping Emma with math homework. Then weekend trips to museums and parks, Vivien trading her designer suits for jeans and sneakers, learning to navigate the subway system she'd never needed before. Piano recitals where she sat in elementary school auditoriums, applauding as enthusiastically as any other parent. The breakthrough had come 3 months ago when Emma had a nightmare and called for both Daddy and Vivien in the same breath. Jacob had found them curled together on Emma's bed, Vivien reading from a worn copy of Charlotte's Web, while his daughter listened with rapt attention. In that moment, watching 2 of the most important people in his life find comfort in each other, Jacob had known with absolute certainty that this was forever. "Is she going to say yes?" Emma asked, now slipping her small hand into his larger one. Jacob squeezed gently, marveling at his daughter's perceptiveness. They'd talked about this moment for weeks, Emma as excited about the prospect of officially making Vivien part of their family as Jacob was nervous about it. "I hope so, Em. But even if she needs time to think about it, that's okay too." Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "She loves us, Daddy. I can tell." "How can you tell?" "The way she looks at you when she thinks you're not watching. Like Mommy used to look at you in the pictures." Emma paused, her young face thoughtful. "And she looks at me like I'm hers already." Jacob felt his throat tighten. His daughter had adapted to their new reality with the resilience that children possessed, but she'd also maintained a perfect connection to Sarah's memory. Vivien had never tried to replace Sarah, had always honored Emma's mother's place in their hearts, while carving out her own space beside it. "I think you're right, sweetheart." "Of course I'm right. I'm 8 now. I know about love." Jacob laughed, the sound echoing in the empty conference room. "Yes, you do." The sound of heels clicking against marble announced Vivien's arrival. She entered the conference room like sunrise breaking over the horizon, radiant, purposeful, beautiful, in a way that still took Jacob's breath away after all these months. She wore a cream-colored dress that emphasized her elegant figure, her dark hair swept up in a style that revealed the graceful line of her neck. But it was her eyes that captured him, those storm cloud gray eyes that now held warmth instead of ice, love instead of loneliness. "Good morning, my favorite people," she said, her voice carrying the kind of genuine joy that had replaced the professional mask she'd worn for so many years. Emma launched herself into Vivien's arms with the enthusiasm of a child secure in her welcome. "Vivien, did you see the surprise Daddy and I set up? I haven't looked yet. Should I?" "Yes, but close your eyes first." Vivien caught Jacob's gaze over Emma's head, her expression puzzled but trusting. "All right, eyes closed." Jacob and Emma had spent the early morning transforming the sterile conference room into something magical. They'd arranged dozens of white roses, Vivien's favorites, throughout the space, each bouquet tied with ribbons in varying shades of blue to match Emma's dress. Photographs were scattered across the conference table, pictures of their 6 months together capturing moments both grand and intimate. There was Vivien teaching Emma to ice skate at Rockefeller Center, both of them laughing as they struggled to stay upright. Jacob and Vivien at a charity gala, looking every inch the power couple, but with eyes only for each other. The three of them building a snowman in Central Park. Emma perched on Jacob's shoulders, while Vivien placed a carrot nose with scientific precision. But it was the newest addition that made the scene perfect, a small easel holding a painting Emma had created in art class. It showed 3 stick figures holding hands in front of a house, with a crooked chimney and flowers that defied all botanical logic. At the top, in Emma's careful 8-year-old handwriting, were the words, "My family." "Okay, you can look now," Emma announced. Vivien opened her eyes and gasped. Her hands flew to her mouth as she took in the transformed room, the photos, the flowers, the painting that proclaimed them a family, with the unvarnished honesty that only children possessed. "Oh my God," she whispered, tears already gathering in her eyes. This is beautiful." "Do you like it?" Emma asked anxiously. "I painted it myself. Mrs. Chen says I have artistic vision." "I love it more than anything I've ever seen," Vivien said, crouching down to Emma's level. "It's perfect." Jacob watched the exchange, his heart hammering against his ribs as he prepared for the most important moment of his new life. The ring box felt impossibly heavy in his pocket, not because of the 3-carat diamond it contained, but because of everything it represented. Hope. Future. The promise that love could indeed conquer the practical realities that kept people apart. He'd chosen the ring with Emma's help, spending an entire Saturday visiting jewelry stores while his daughter offered commentary on every option. She'd rejected anything too flashy. Vivien doesn't like to show off, too traditional. She's not like other grown-ups, or too small. It has to be special. Daddy, she's special. When they'd finally found the perfect stone, a brilliant cut diamond set in platinum, elegant without being ostentatious, Emma had nodded with the satisfaction of someone who understood exactly what love should look like. "Vivien," Jacob said, his voice rougher than intended, "there's something else." She turned toward him, still wiping tears from her cheeks, and froze as she saw him dropping to one knee. The ring box appeared in his hands as if by magic, and Vivien's sharp intake of breath was audible in the sudden silence. "Jacob," she whispered. "6 months ago, I was a man who had given up on the possibility of love, of happiness, of anything beyond just surviving from one day to the next." He began his prepared speech, forgotten in favor of words that came straight from his heart. "I was content to live in the shadows, to clean up other people's messes while my own life remained small and safe and utterly without hope." Emma moved to stand beside him, her small hand resting on his shoulder in support. "Then you walked into that courtroom and everything changed. Not just because you needed help, though you did, but because you reminded me who I used to be, who I could be again. You saw something in me that I had forgotten existed." Vivien's tears were flowing freely now, but she made no move to wipe them away. Her eyes were fixed on his face with an intensity that made the rest of the world fade away. "But more than that," Jacob continued, "you taught Emma and me what it means to be a family again. Not just the 2 of us surviving together, but 3 people choosing each other, supporting each other, loving each other completely and without reservation." He opened the ring box, revealing the diamond that caught the morning light, and threw it back in brilliant fragments. "Vivien Storm, brilliant CEO, defender of justice, the woman who makes my daughter laugh and makes me believe in happy endings again, will you marry me?" The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Vivien stared at the ring, at Jacob, kneeling before her, at Emma, watching with barely contained excitement. Jacob felt his heart hammering so hard he was certain it was audible. "You want to marry me," Vivien said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Even though I'm complicated and demanding and completely inexperienced at being part of a family, especially because of those things. Even though marrying me means your life will never be private again, that Emma will grow up in the spotlight, that everything you do will be scrutinized and analyzed and probably criticized. As long as we're doing it together." Even though I work 18-hour days and travel constantly and sometimes forget that normal people need more than 4 hours of sleep. Jacob smiled, the expression transforming his entire face. Even though, especially though, Vivien, I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to be mine. Emma couldn't contain herself any longer. Say yes, Vivien. Please say yes. I already drew pictures of our wedding. Vivien laughed through her tears, the sound pure joy mixed with overwhelming emotion. She looked at Emma's eager face, at Jacob's hopeful expression, at the ring that represented not just a proposal, but a complete transformation of everything she'd believed possible for her life. Yes, she whispered. Then louder, with the commanding authority that had built an empire, yes, of course, yes. Jacob slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that shook slightly, and then Vivien was in his arms, kissing him with a passion that conveyed everything words couldn't express. Emma squealed with delight, wrapping her arms around both adults and creating a three-way embrace that felt like the most natural thing in the world. We're going to be a real family, Emma announced with 8-year-old certainty. Can I be the flower girl? Can we have chocolate cake? Can Vivien wear a princess dress? Yes to all of it, Vivien said, laughing as she admired the ring on her finger. Especially the princess dress. As they stood together in the conference room, surrounded by flowers and photographs and the promise of forever, Jacob marveled at the chain of events that had led to this moment. If he hadn't been working that early morning shift, if Vivien hadn't arrived at the courthouse before dawn, if he hadn't found the courage to stand up and speak for justice, none of this would have happened. But it had happened. Against all odds, against every practical consideration, against the vast gulf that separated their worlds, they had found each other. More than that, they had built something beautiful and lasting and absolutely right. So what happens now? Vivien asked, still admiring her ring. Now we plan a wedding, Jacob said, and figure out where we're all going to live, and navigate the media storm that's going to erupt when this becomes public, and probably deal with your board of directors having collective heart attacks. Actually, about the board, Vivien said with a smile that suggested she had secrets. I've been making some changes. Stormtech is going fully public benefit corporation. Profit with purpose. Justice and technology working hand in hand to make the world better. Jacob stared at her. You've been planning this. I've been planning a lot of things, including this. She gestured to encompass the transformed conference room. Did you really think I didn't know you were going to propose today? Emma has been dropping hints for weeks. I have not, Emma protested, but her grin gave her away. You told me last Tuesday that Daddy was acting funny and that he'd been looking at jewelry stores online, Vivien pointed out. That's not dropping hints, that's being observant. Jacob shook his head in amazement. I should have known you two were conspiring. It's not conspiring, Emma said seriously. It's making sure everything goes right, because this is important. Yes. Vivien agreed, her voice soft with emotion, as she looked at the two people who had become her entire world. This is the most important thing that's ever happened to me. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of phone calls and excited planning. Emma insisted on immediately calling Mrs. Rodriguez to share the news, while Vivien fielded calls from her assistant, her publicist, and various board members who had somehow already learned about the engagement. Jacob found himself marveling at how quickly their private moment had become public knowledge, but he discovered that he didn't mind as much as he'd expected. Let the world watch. Let them speculate and analyze and judge. What he and Vivien had built together was strong enough to withstand any scrutiny, deep enough to weather any storm. They had found each other across impossible odds and built a love that was both fairy tale and utterly real. The wedding 6 months later was everything Emma had dreamed of and more. They held it in Central Park on a perfect autumn day, with golden leaves falling like confetti and the city skyline providing a backdrop that was both magical and quintessentially theirs. Vivien wore a dress that was indeed fit for a princess, silk and lace, and dreams made manifest, while Jacob wore a tuxedo that transformed him from janitor to prince without losing any of his fundamental decency. Emma served as both flower girl and ring bearer, taking her duties with the seriousness they deserved. She wore a dress the exact shade of her new mother's eyes, and when she walked down the aisle scattering rose petals, there wasn't a dry eye among the 300 guests. The guest list itself told the story of how their worlds had merged. Sarah's parents sat in the front row beside Vivien's board of directors. Jacob's former colleagues from the courthouse shared tables with tech industry leaders. Emma's teacher sat next to a federal judge. It was a gathering that should have been awkward, incompatible, but somehow worked perfectly, perhaps because everyone present understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. Judge Blackwood, the man who had presided over their first meeting, officiated the ceremony. His words were simple and profound. "Love," he said, "is the ultimate justice. It sees past surface differences to essential truth. It stands up for what matters most. It refuses to accept that some barriers cannot be crossed." When Jacob and Vivien exchanged vows, their words were not the standard promises, but personal truths that laid their hearts bare before everyone they cared about. "Jacob," Vivien said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "You taught me that strength isn't about standing alone, it's about choosing the right person to stand with. You showed me that justice isn't just a legal concept, it's a way of living, of loving, of being human. I promise to stand with you through every storm, to build a life that honors both where we came from and where we're going together." Jacob's response came from the deepest part of his soul. "Vivien, you saved me from a life half-lived. You reminded me that giving up is a choice, and choosing hope is an act of courage. I promise to fight for our love the way you taught me to fight for justice with everything I have against any odds for as long as we both shall live." When they kissed, sealing their union before God and witnesses and the watching world, the applause was thunderous. But Jacob barely heard it. His entire world had narrowed to the woman in his arms, the daughter beaming beside them, and the future they would build together. The reception was held at Stormtech Tower, transformed for the evening into something magical. The same conference room where Jacob had proposed had become a ballroom with flowers everywhere and photographs documenting not just their love story, but the merger of two families into something new and beautiful. Emma gave a speech that brought down the house. "My daddy used to be sad," she announced into the microphone with 8-year-old frankness, "but Vivien made him happy again. And Vivien used to work too much, but Daddy taught her that families are more important than meetings. Now we're all happy together, which is exactly how it should be." As the evening wound down and guests began to drift away, Jacob found himself alone with his new wife on the terrace, overlooking the city. The lights of Manhattan twinkled below them like earthbound stars, and Vivien was radiant in his arms, still wearing her princess dress, but with her shoes kicked off and her hair slightly mussed from dancing. "Any regrets?" he asked, only half joking. "Only that it took us so long to find each other," she replied, settling more comfortably against his chest. "We found each other exactly when we were supposed to," Jacob said with the wisdom of someone who had learned that timing was everything. "If we'd met before Sarah died, before you built Stormtech, before Emma came into my life, we wouldn't have been ready for this." "You think we're ready now?" Jacob looked through the glass doors at Emma, who was curled up asleep in a chair, still wearing her flower girl dress and clutching a bouquet of roses. Their daughter, because she was theirs now, in every way that mattered. "I think we're perfect for each other, which is different from being perfect," he said. "I think we're going to fight sometimes and disappoint each other occasionally, and have to work hard to keep building this thing we've created. But I also think we're going to love each other through all of it." Vivien tilted her head up to look at him, her storm cloud eyes now holding nothing but clear skies. "Forever. Forever." They danced on the terrace under the stars, moving to music only they could hear, two people who had found their way to each other across every barrier that should have kept them apart. Below them, the city hummed with the lives of 8 million people, each with their own story, their own struggles, their own dreams of finding someone to love and be loved by in return. But 40 floors above it all, Jacob Lane and Vivien Storm Lane had already found their happy ending. Not perfect, not without challenges, but absolutely real and completely theirs. They had learned that love was indeed the ultimate justice, that sometimes the janitor really could win the princess, and that fairy tales could come true for those brave enough to fight for them. As the night grew late and Emma stirred sleepily in her chair, they gathered their daughter and headed home together, Not to the penthouse or the modest apartment where their separate lives had unfolded, but to the brownstone in Brooklyn they'd bought together, with a garden where Emma could play and room for the family they were still becoming. It was a house that belonged to all of them, filled with photographs that told their story. The courthouse steps where it all began. The first family dinner, Emma's piano recitals with Vivien beaming in the audience, quiet moments of domestic happiness that no camera had captured but memory had preserved. And in the master bedroom, on Vivien's nightstand beside her wedding ring, sat a small framed photograph from their second day as a family. Jacob in his work clothes, Emma on his shoulders, and Vivien in jeans and sneakers, all three of them covered in ice cream and laughing at some joke that probably wasn't even funny. It was a picture of people who had found their way home to each other, who had learned that the greatest victories weren't won in courtrooms or boardrooms, but in the quiet moments when broken hearts decided to trust again, when lonely people chose to love, when janitors had the courage to defend princesses, and princesses had the wisdom to see that sometimes the most valuable person in the room was the one everyone else overlooked. Their story had begun with a single act of courage in a federal courtroom, but it would continue for decades to come in board meetings where Jacob's voice ensured that justice remained central to corporate decisions in elementary school events, where Vivien cheered louder than any other parent in quiet Sunday mornings when all three of them piled into one bed to read the newspaper and plan adventures. They had saved each other, and in saving each other, they had created something beautiful and lasting and absolutely worth fighting for, a family built not on DNA or social expectations, but on choice, on love, on the revolutionary idea that sometimes the most unlikely people make the most perfect matches. And if that wasn't a fairy tale ending, worthy of the ages, Jacob thought as he drifted off to sleep with his wife in his arms and his daughter safely down the hall, then fairy tales didn't know what they were missing. The janitor had defended the princess had chosen the janitor, and together they had built something more magical than either had dared to dream. A love that would last forever, proved in courtrooms and lived in kitchens as real as morning coffee, and as enduring as the stars that watched over their Brooklyn brownstone, where three hearts beat in perfect synchrony, finally and forever home.